Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. I'm Dr. Downey, and today we're going to be talking about the best testosterone dose. None of this is medical advice, this is just my personal opinion. I'll be drawing on anecdotal evidence as well as a bit of scientific evidence. But yeah, let's get into it. So this is a question that's quite commonly asked because testosterone is the starter steroid that everyone tends to use, and they always ask, what is the best dose? So the issue with this is that there aren't a lot of studies around this topic in terms of like the best dose for bodybuilding. There's obviously like doses that are recommended for TRT and things like that, and a lot of research on that, but in terms of bodybuilding, there's no general consensus in the medical world around which dose is best. So a lot of people just draw on their own opinions when answering this topic. So I think the best answer to this question has been by Vigorous Steve. He made a video about this, so watch that if you're interested. But again, that was just through his experience as a personal trainer, and it's difficult to make recommendations on off of science when there isn't much to give. One of the most important things when judging what dose would suit you best is personal characteristics. If you're skinny and nowhere near your genetic potential, you'll probably gain quite a significant amount of smaller doses. So a lot of people who start using steroids are not close to their genetic potential, and for the majority of people, any dose would work. Any dose above TRT would work. Along with this, again, kind of touches on the notion of how long you've been training and things like that, but how heavy you are in terms of lean tissue, and just like how tall you are or how big your frame is. Bigger people will probably need a larger dose to see the same effect as someone who is lighter than them. And of course there are genetics, because there are polymorphisms of the androgen receptors and things like that. Although we don't have much science to say how much of a role they play, we've seen it with African populations having the best response to gear. Although I do live in an African country, and I must say the response kind of depends on where in Africa you are from. So again, there is variability within certain races, so these recommendations are quite difficult to make. So having taken that all into account, this would probably mean that a milligram per kilogram dose recommendation is probably best. This recommendation should be made on your lean tissue. However, majority of people have different ways of measuring their body fat and things like that, and it's not really accurate. So this recommendation is usually going to be based off someone within the 10 to 20% body fat range. So in general, when starting, you'd preferably start at a lower dose, especially if you've never touched gear before, because side effects appear to be more pronounced, and as time goes on you get used to them, and then certain doses don't affect you the same way they would have when you first started. But in general, when starting, most people go for the milligram per pound recommendation, or 2.25 milligram per kg recommendation. But the majority of people, and I've seen this, will have to titrate up from that dose, because that recommendation is essentially glorified TRT, and if you remember correctly, TRT is just replacement. It's not meant to make you gain more muscle than a natural person would. Well, a natural person with decent testosterone levels. Furthermore, as you progress in the gym and as you reach certain plateaus, you will increase the dose, and this was mentioned by Vigorously Steve. This is a slower and much smarter approach. So usually you'd use intervals of 6 to 10 weeks and titrate up from there. So in dosages of about 200 milligrams, assuming testosterone is the only compound you are running. If you're running other compounds, the total increase in injectables would probably be around a 200 milligram increase every 6 to 10 weeks, and then you do this until your cycle ends. A lot of people will mention the fact, or the term quite commonly used by more plates, more dates, about diminishing returns as you go up with your dosages. I've addressed this in a different video. The study he referenced itself wasn't the best, but it's the best we have, and he didn't interpret it correctly, or perhaps he just didn't read out certain bits, so people have make different assumptions off of it. So in the video, there were multiple different groups, but of interest was the 300 milligram per week group versus 600 milligram per week group. So the 300 milligram per week group gained about 5 kgs in lean tissue, whereas the 600 milligram per week group gained about 8. So one would assume that if you double the dose, you'd get double the results. But it wasn't showed in this study. However, in other studies with 600 milligrams, the results tend to be closer to 10 to 12 kilograms in lean tissue, but in this study, that wasn't displayed. So from this, he essentially makes the conclusion that 300 milligrams is probably the best dose, and anything more than that is probably not as good because you would get more side effects. Because one would assume if you go up with from 300 to 600, your side effects are going to increase. But he failed to mention that in that same study, the prevalence of side effects were more or less the same in the 300 milligram group and 600 milligram group. It was around 10 to 15%. Whereas the TRT group didn't really report any side effects, which isn't really surprising. So from the study, he defined the point of diminishing returns as being 300 milligrams. Again, the study wasn't the best, but from the study, yes, it would make sense that 300 milligrams is the point of diminishing returns. This is for the average individual. But if you remember, as I just mentioned, the 600 milligram group did gain a significant amount of muscle more than the 300 milligram per week group, and experienced the same amount of side effects. Now, I'm not suggesting you use a higher dose, I'm just reading out what was observed in the study. So the issue when he defined 300 milligrams as the point of diminishing returns is a lot of people made their own assumptions. And the assumption was that if you go above this point, using a dose higher than 300 milligrams is pointless because the gains aren't as good and you'll get more side effects. But as we just displayed, 600 milligrams had the same amount of side effects, whereas it had almost double the amount of gains. So I'm not suggesting you use a higher dose, I'm just showing that it was interpreted a bit incorrectly, either by him or viewers of that video. A more practical upper limit, and this is anecdotal since we don't have many studies on this, would be 1 gram of testosterone a week. Just through what I've seen with individuals, as you start increasing the dose to more than 1 gram, you start noticing side effects more frequently, and I would say the prevalence of side effects would start increasing to almost 50%, whereas before it was 10 to 15%. So a more practical upper limit would be around 1 gram. Anything less than that would give you a prevalence rate of 10 to 15%. That doesn't mean you won't get side effects, it just means the majority of people won't. So again, this point of 1 gram is what I recommend as being the maximum for anyone not looking to compete or become a mass monster, because as you pass this point, side effects tend to accumulate and they need to be managed, and for most individuals these side effects are not worth the gains. However, for someone who is a mass monster trying to reach that level of maximum yield is more important for them, but I don't think it is important for the majority of people. Now, that was more of a dose recommendation for, let's say, blasts or a cycle. When you cruise, if you do cruise, a dose is almost similar to that of TRT is probably best. However, some may go just slightly more than that so they can keep more muscle. So usually a recommendation of 0.75 to 1 milligram per pound per week is recommended, or this is about 2 to 2.5 milligrams per kg is recommended. And this is for the average individual, whereas if you are a competitive athlete or bodybuilder, powerlifter, you'd want to keep most of the strength and size you gained on cycle, and you don't really want to lose too much of that because that could hinder your progression. So usually for those individuals, 3 to 4 milligrams per kg per week is recommended. Or not recommended, but is commonly used. But Leo in Longevity disagrees with this approach. I think he mentioned this in one of his podcasts that he dislikes the milligram per kg or per pound of body weight approach because it's old school and it doesn't take into account polymorphisms at the androgen receptor, which is not incorrect. However, it's just becoming nitpicky. And for the majority of people, these recommendations work the same. Obviously, there are polymorphisms and genetic outliers, but for 95% of the population, this recommendation will probably work best. What he's talking about is the study of pharmacogenetics, which we do not have enough research on. We barely have enough to make any recommendation, let alone take into account genetic variabilities. Furthermore, most drug recommendations are based off a milligram per kg basis, and if not, they're based on the average 70 kilogram individual. So in conclusion, just remember, everyone is different and not everything is going to work the same for each person. But the best measure is probably a milligram per kilogram basis or per pound basis. The dosages for most individuals should be kept less than a gram, especially if you're not looking to harm yourself or be reckless. I'm not suggesting anyone uses this approach, but I just thought I would add my opinion anyway. So I hope you enjoyed that video. Let me know if you agree, disagree, what your approach to this is, and I will see you in the